I am Hercule Poirot. Welcome to my new mystery story.
There are few things more unsettling than the sound of laughter echoing through empty corridors on a winter's night. And Greystone Manor on Christmas Eve of 1934 seemed to collect such sounds in its ancient stones, like a vault collecting whispers. The snow had begun falling at tea time, transforming the Yorkshire countryside into a pristine wilderness that would, by morning, render the manor as isolated as a ship becalmed at sea. I had arrived that afternoon at the invitation of Colonel Geoffrey Hartwell, an old friend whose wife had developed an enthusiasm for elaborate entertaining that bordered on the theatrical. The occasion was to be Lady Constance Blackwood's famous Christmas Eve gathering, a tradition that had survived even the recent death of her husband, Sir Reginald, though perhaps not unchanged by it. The drawing-room glowed with the warm light of a dozen oil lamps, their flames reflecting off the crystal decanters and polished silver that adorned every surface. Lady Constance herself presided over the assembly with the quiet authority of a woman accustomed to command. At 60, she retained the sharp intelligence that had made her one of London's most formidable hostesses, though grief had carved new lines around her steel-grey eyes. "Captain Hastings," she said, extending a gloved hand as I was announced. "How good of you to brave the weather. I trust your journey from London was not too arduous." "Not at all, Lady Constance, though I confess the roads are becoming rather treacherous." "Excellent," she replied with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Then we shall have a properly intimate gathering, with no possibility of early departures." The company assembled in her drawing-room was indeed select, though I sensed undercurrents of tension beneath the polite conversation. Dr. Marcus Pemberton, the local physician, stood near the fireplace with the careful posture of a man who had learned to measure his words. His attendance seemed to cause Lady Constance particular satisfaction, though he appeared less comfortable with the arrangement. Miss Victoria Ashworth, Lady Constance's goddaughter, moved through the room with the ethereal grace of a woman who seemed to exist slightly apart from the world around her. Her companion, the enigmatic Mr. Adrian Cross, observed everything with dark eyes that missed nothing while revealing nothing of his own thoughts. James Whitmore, Lady Constance's nephew and heir, had arrived with his wife Eleanor, both wearing expressions of barely concealed anxiety. Colonel Reginald Ashford, recently returned from India, maintained his military bearing despite a haunted quality in his pale blue eyes that suggested unpleasant memories. The most intriguing guest, however, was Madame Petrova, a Russian émigré whose dramatic beauty was matched only by her air of mysterious tragedy. She had attached herself to the household some months earlier, ostensibly as a companion to Lady Constance, though her true purpose remained a subject of speculation among the servants. "My dear friends," Lady Constance announced as we gathered for dinner, "I've planned a special entertainment for this evening. A Christmas game, if you will, inspired by the old traditions of mystery and revelation that mark this sacred season." She gestured toward an ornate wooden box that sat upon the sideboard, its surface carved with intricate symbols. Within this box are 12 sealed envelopes, each containing a role in our little drama. We shall draw lots after dinner, and then, as the clock strikes each hour leading to midnight, we shall enact a series of, shall we say, dramatic scenes throughout the house. "What sort of scenes?" inquired Dr. Pemberton with professional caution. Lady Constance's smile was enigmatic. "Oh, nothing too alarming, Doctor. Merely a game of detection with clues and red herrings, accusations and alibis. Think of it as a living mystery novel, with each of us playing our assigned part." I noticed several guests exchange glances that suggested this entertainment was not entirely welcome, though none dared voice objection to their hostess. As dinner concluded and we drew our mysterious envelopes, the grandfather clock in the hall chimed 9 times. Lady Constance consulted a small leather notebook she carried, then announced, "The game begins now. Those with red seals, please proceed to your designated rooms. The first scene will commence in precisely 15 minutes. What followed was an hour of elaborate theatrical nonsense. Screams from the library as Colonel Ashford discovered a body, actually a dressmaker's dummy. Mysterious footprints in the conservatory that led nowhere, and a poisoned glass of wine that changed color through some chemical trick. Yet as the evening progressed, I began to sense that beneath the surface of this elaborate charade lay currents of genuine menace. Lady Constance watched each performance with an intensity that seemed to go beyond mere entertainment, making notes in her little book with the precision of a judge recording evidence. It was as the clock struck 11 that the game took a decidedly sinister turn. We had gathered in the drawing room for what Lady Constance announced would be the grand revelation, when suddenly the lights went out. In the darkness, we heard a woman scream, not theatrical this time, but raw with genuine terror. When the lights returned, Lady Constance lay crumpled beside her writing desk, her notebook scattered on the floor, its pages fluttering in the draught from a window that had somehow come open. Dr. Pemberton rushed to her side, but even I could see from across the room that his ministrations would be futile. "She's gone," he announced quietly, his voice cutting through the shocked silence. "Heart failure, by the look of it, though." He paused, examining something more closely. "This is most peculiar." "What is it, Doctor?" I asked, moving closer. "Her hand. She's clutching something." With careful fingers, he pried open Lady Constance's rigid grasp to reveal a small golden ornament in the shape of a partridge. "And there's this mark on her neck. Barely visible, but—" Before he could finish, Madame Petrova gave a sharp cry and pointed toward the mantelpiece. There, where a valuable jade figurine had stood for decades, was an empty space and a small card bearing a single line written in an elegant hand. "The first day of Christmas." As we stood in stunned silence, the implications began to sink in. The roads were impassable, the telephone lines down in the storm, and somewhere among us walked a killer whose game had only just begun. It was then that I remembered a telegram I had sent that morning to a certain Belgian gentleman in London, inviting him to join us for the holidays. "We must search the house," declared Colonel Ashford, falling back on military instincts. "Secure all exits, account for everyone." "I think," I said quietly, watching the snow continue to fall beyond the windows, "that we should instead prepare ourselves for a very long night, and pray that the morning brings not only the police, but a particular friend of mine whose understanding of the criminal mind may be our only hope of survival." Outside, the wind howled through the bare branches of the oak trees, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled midnight, its sound muffled by the snow, but carrying with it an ominous promise of the 12 dark hours that lay ahead. The silence that followed Dr. Pemberton's examination was profound, broken only by the steady tick of the grandfather clock and the wind's relentless assault against the windows. Eleanor Whitmore pressed her handkerchief to her lips, stifling what might have been a sob or a scream. Her husband James stood rigid beside her, his face pale as the snow gathering on the windowsills. "Heart failure, you said." Colonel Ashford's voice cut through the quiet with military precision. "But that mark on her neck is consistent with pressure from a sharp object," Dr. Pemberton confirmed grimly. He held up the golden partridge, its surface gleaming malevolently in the lamplight. The edges of this ornament could certainly have caused such a wound. Combined with the shock, it would have been sufficient to stop her heart. Madame Petrova crossed herself with theatrical fervor. But who would do such a thing, and why leave such an obvious calling card? Her accent seemed more pronounced now, as if fear had stripped away her careful English pronunciation. "The window," I observed, moving closer to examine the gap where cold air continued to seep through. "It's been forced open just enough to create a draught. When the lights went out—" "We were all here," Miss Victoria Ashworth interrupted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Everyone was accounted for in this room when it happened." Adrian Cross, who had remained eerily silent, finally spoke. Were we? In the darkness, with all that confusion, could we truly account for every soul? Before anyone could respond, the unmistakable sound of the front door's heavy brass knocker echoed through the hall. We froze, exchanging glances of mingled hope and terror. Who could possibly venture out on such a night? James Whitmore gripped the poker from the fireplace. "I'll see who it is." "We go together," Colonel Ashford declared. "No one ventures anywhere alone." But as we moved toward the hall, I felt a familiar flutter of anticipation. The timing, though extraordinary, seemed almost too perfect to be mere coincidence. My telegram that morning had been sent on impulse, an invitation extended to an old friend for the holidays. Could it possibly be? The butler, Larkin, emerged from the servants' quarters, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled by sleep and alarm. He fumbled with the heavy bolts, his hands shaking as he drew back the door. A gust of Arctic air swept into the hall, carrying with it swirls of snow and the small, precise figure of Hercule Poirot. He stood on the threshold like a study in determined elegance, his overcoat dusted with snow, his moustaches perfectly waxed despite the storm. In one gloved hand, he carried his familiar leather valise, and his dark eyes surveyed our assembled group with the keen intelligence I remembered so well. "Mes amis," he said, stepping carefully across the threshold and stamping the snow from his patent leather shoes. "I perceive that my arrival is most timely, though perhaps not for the reasons I had hoped." "Poirot!" I exclaimed, relief flooding through me. "But how on earth did you manage to get through?" "The train from London arrived before the worst of the storm, mon ami. I took rooms at the village inn, intending to present myself in the morning. But the little grey cells, they were restless, and something in your telegram suggested that perhaps Christmas Eve at Greystone Manor might prove more eventful than a simple holiday gathering." His gaze moved past me to the drawing room, taking in the covered form on the chaise, the scattered papers, the empty space on the mantelpiece. I see that Hercule Poirot's instincts were, as usual, correct. Dr. Pemberton stepped forward. "Sir, I'm afraid there's been a tragedy. Lady Constance Blackwood is dead, and the circumstances suggest—" "Murder," Poirot finished quietly. He removed his gloves with characteristic precision, folding them neatly before placing them in his coat pocket. "Oui, this much is evident even from her. The question is not what has happened, but who among you has made of Christmas Eve a night of death?" He moved into the drawing room with measured steps, his eyes cataloguing every detail. The golden partridge, the forced window, the overturned notebook. Nothing escaped his notice. "Now then," he said, turning to face us all with that familiar mixture of courtesy and authority, "we shall proceed methodically. First, I must examine the scene undisturbed. Then, each of you will tell Poirot exactly what occurred this evening, from the beginning, and we shall discover which of you has been playing a very different game than the one Lady Constance intended." The investigation had begun. Poirot moved through the drawing room with the measured precision of a clockmaker, his dark eyes cataloguing every detail with an intensity that made the assembled company shift uncomfortably. He knelt beside Lady Constance's still form, not touching but observing the angle of her fall, the positioning of her hands, the way her silk evening gown had settled around her. "The wound," he murmured to Dr. Pemberton. "You say it was made by the ornament, but observe, mon docteur, the angle suggests she was facing her attacker, not taken by surprise from behind." "Yes," Pemberton confirmed quietly. "The mark is consistent with a deliberate strike, though the force required would not have been great. The shock to someone of her age, combined with any underlying heart condition." "Ah, but did Lady Constance suffer from such a condition?" The doctor hesitated. "Nothing serious. Mild palpitations occasionally, but she was in remarkable health for her age." Poirot rose and moved to the scattered pages of the notebook, gathering them with careful hands. As he read, his expression grew increasingly thoughtful. "Hastings, you described this evening as a game, oui? But these pages, they tell a different story entirely. I moved closer to peer over his shoulder. The neat handwriting covered page after page, but these were not game instructions. Instead, I saw detailed observations about each guest's behavior throughout the evening. "She was watching us," Eleanor Whitmore whispered, her voice barely audible, "taking notes on everything we did." "More than watching, madame. She was testing." Poirot held up one page. "See here, she notes that when the mock poisoning was staged, Monsieur Cross stepped backward exactly 3 paces and touched his left wrist. When the body was discovered in the library, Mademoiselle Ashworth's first glance was toward the window, not the supposed corpse." Adrian Cross's face had gone pale. "What are you suggesting?" "I suggest nothing yet, monsieur. I merely observe that Lady Constance was conducting an investigation of her own. The question is what or whom she suspected." Colonel Ashford cleared his throat roughly. Constance had been different since Reginald's death. More suspicious, more watchful. She'd become convinced that someone close to the family was harboring dangerous secrets. And tonight's entertainment was designed to expose these secrets, Poirot concluded. Each scene, each dramatic moment carefully calculated to provoke revealing responses. He moved to the mantelpiece where the jade figurine had stood. This missing piece, it was valuable? "Priceless," James Whitmore answered. "A Ming Dynasty artifact. But surely the theft was secondary to murder, oui. But was it theft, or was it a message?" Poirot examined the calling card again. "The handwriting is educated, the paper expensive. This is not the work of a common criminal." The grandfather clock chimed midnight, its sound echoing through the silent house. As the last note faded, we heard something else, a soft thud from somewhere above, followed by the faint tinkle of breaking glass. "The bedrooms," Colonel Ashford said grimly. "We remain together," Poirot commanded. "But first, I must ask each of you to recall precisely where you stood when the lights failed. The darkness, it permits movement and conceals intention." One by one, he questioned each guest about their exact position during those crucial moments. Madame Petrova claimed to have been by the piano, feeling someone brush past her in the darkness. Miss Ashworth had been near the hearth, hearing the sound of breaking glass. Mr. Cross maintained he had remained in the doorway to the hall. As each person spoke, Poirot made careful notes in his own small notebook, his pen scratching quietly in the tense silence. I noticed he paid particular attention to the slight inconsistencies in their accounts, the nervous gestures, the way certain individuals avoided meeting his gaze. "The window," he said finally, moving to examine the forced casement. It was opened not for escape, but for effect, to create the impression of an intruder while the real killer remained among us. Another sound from upstairs interrupted him, this time the unmistakable creak of floorboards. Someone was moving about in the guest quarters. "It appears," Poirot said quietly, his hand moving to his waistcoat pocket where I knew he kept his small revolver, "that our killer's work for this evening is not yet complete. Come, mes amis, we shall investigate together, for I suspect we are about to discover what Lady Constance died trying to protect." The game had indeed taken a deadly turn. The night was far from over. We ascended the grand staircase together, our footsteps muffled by the thick Persian runner, but still echoing in the hushed corridors. The oil lamps we carried cast wavering shadows on the portraits lining the walls, their painted eyes seeming to follow our progress with silent judgment. Poirot moved with his characteristic precision, neither hurried nor hesitant, his dark eyes cataloguing every detail of our surroundings. The source of the disturbance became apparent as we reached the first-floor landing. A door stood slightly ajar at the end of the corridor, and from within came the soft tinkle of settling glass. Colonel Ashford gestured toward it with his free hand. "The morning room," he said quietly. "Constance kept some of her smaller collection there." We approached cautiously, and Poirot raised his hand for silence before pushing the door fully open. The scene within was one of calculated destruction. A tall, Display cabinet had been shattered, its glass doors hanging in jagged fragments. 2 velvet-lined compartments stood empty, their contents vanished, leaving only the faint impressions where delicate objects had once rested. On the carpet between the broken glass lay another calling card, its elegant script unmistakable. The second day of Christmas. "The turtle doves," James Whitmore said hoarsely, staring at the empty spaces. "Ivory, Renaissance period." They were wedding gifts to Constance's great-grandmother. Poirot knelt carefully beside the debris, his trained eye taking in every detail. The glass was broken from inside, not outside. See how the fragments lie? And observe, the lock on the cabinet shows no signs of forcing. Someone with access to the key performed this work. Dr. Pemberton moved closer to examine the damage. But surely the sound would have been heard throughout the house. Not if it was done during the confusion following Lady Constance's death, Eleanor Whitmore observed, her voice barely above a whisper. When we were all focused on other matters. Poirot rose and moved to the window, which remained securely latched from within. No external entry here. Our thief was already among us. He turned to face the assembled group, his gaze moving from person to person with uncomfortable intensity. But this is not mere theft, mes amis. The pattern suggests something far more personal. Adrian Cross, who had remained silent throughout our examination, finally spoke. "The items taken, they are not the most valuable pieces in the collection. If this were simple robbery, a professional would have chosen differently." "You speak with authority, monsieur," Poirot observed mildly. "Perhaps you could enlighten us about the relative values involved." Cross hesitated, and in that moment of uncertainty, I saw something flicker across his features. Calculation, perhaps, or fear. I have some knowledge of such matters. Lady Constance occasionally sought my advice about her collection. Advice of what nature? Insurance valuations, primarily. The estate has faced certain financial pressures since Sir Reginald's death. Lady Constance was exploring various options. James Whitmore's face darkened. What sort of options? Before Cross could answer, Madame Petrova gave a sharp intake of breath. She was staring at something on the floor beside the broken cabinet, a small leather portfolio that had apparently fallen from within one of the damaged compartments. Poirot moved swiftly to examine it, using his handkerchief to avoid direct contact. The portfolio contained detailed photographs and descriptions of various items from throughout the house. The jade figurine from the drawing room, the ivory doves now missing, several other valuable pieces. Beside each photograph were notations in a precise hand. Dimensions, provenance, estimated values. "This is quite comprehensive," Poirot murmured, studying the contents. "Far more detailed than one would expect for simple insurance purposes." Cross's composure finally cracked. "Lady Constance was considering a private sale of certain items. She asked me to prepare a complete assessment." "And you agreed to this arrangement because?" "Because I am in the business of such transactions," Cross admitted reluctantly. "I facilitate private sales for collectors who prefer discretion." Colonel Ashford stepped forward, his military bearing rigid with suspicion. "You mean you're a fence for stolen goods?" "I resent that implication," Cross replied coldly. "I deal exclusively in legitimate transactions between private parties. Lady Constance was facing genuine financial difficulties and wished to liquidate certain assets without public attention." Poirot closed the portfolio and regarded Cross with thoughtful eyes. "And yet, monsieur, this documentation suggests preparation for something far more extensive than the sale of a few pieces. This appears to be a complete inventory of the most valuable items in Greystone Manor." The implications hung heavy in the air. If Cross had been planning a systematic looting of the collection, Lady Constance's death would have been remarkably convenient, eliminating the one person who could expose his activities. "We shall discuss this matter further," Poirot said finally. "But first, I wish to examine the remaining rooms. Our killer's work tonight may not yet be complete." As if summoned by his words, another sound echoed through the house, this time from the floor above. Footsteps, deliberate and measured, moving across the guest quarters where we had all been staying. Poirot's expression grew grimmer. "It appears, mes amis, that someone is conducting their own search of the premises. The question is whether they seek to destroy evidence or to eliminate witnesses." The night was far from over, and I had the distinct impression that the worst was yet to come. We ascended the narrow servants' staircase with deliberate caution, our collective footsteps muffled by the thick runner that had seen decades of quiet service. The temperature dropped noticeably as we climbed, and I found myself pulling my jacket closer against the chill that seemed to seep through the very walls of the ancient manor. Poirot moved ahead of us with his characteristic precision, each step calculated to minimize sound while maximizing his ability to observe our surroundings. The footsteps we had been following ceased abruptly as we reached the second-floor landing, replaced by a silence so profound it seemed almost oppressive. The guest corridor stretched before us, lined with identical doors that had housed each member of our party. From beneath the third door on the left came a thin sliver of lamplight and the faint sound of drawers being opened and closed with systematic care. Poirot raised his hand for silence, then approached the door with the fluid grace of a stalking cat. He pressed his ear against the polished wood, listening intently for several moments before straightening and gesturing for us to position ourselves along the corridor walls. The sounds from within continued. Methodical, purposeful searching that suggested someone knew exactly what they were looking for. Dr. Pemberton shifted nervously beside me, his medical bag clutched tightly in his free hand. I noticed the thin sheen of perspiration on his forehead despite the cold draft that pervaded the upper floors. Colonel Ashford maintained his military bearing, but his jaw was set with barely contained tension. Suddenly, the searching sounds stopped. We waited, scarcely breathing, until Poirot made his decision. Moving swiftly but silently, he pushed open the door and stepped into the room, the rest of us crowding behind him to peer into the chamber beyond. Miss Victoria Ashworth knelt beside her overturned wardrobe, her hands sifting frantically through scattered garments. Her usually composed features were contorted with distress, her dark hair disheveled and falling loose around her shoulders. The room itself told a story of systematic violation. Every drawer had been pulled out and emptied, their contents scattered across the floor like the remnants of a violent storm. "Miss Ashworth," James Whitmore exclaimed, his voice sharp with surprise and suspicion, "what are you doing here?" She started violently, turning to face us with wide, frightened eyes. "I heard noises," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Someone was in my room. I came up to investigate and found this." Indeed, the scene before us was one of thorough ransacking, but it was the small leather jewelry case on her dressing table that drew our immediate attention. The ornate silver box lay overturned, its lock forced and its contents largely missing. On the pillow of her bed, stark against the white linen, lay another calling card bearing the now familiar, elegant script, "The third day of Christmas." Madame Petrova crossed herself dramatically. "The 3 French hens," she whispered. "The emerald set Lady Constance gave you last Christmas, child. They are gone, no?" Victoria nodded mutely, her hands trembling as she gestured toward the violated jewelry case. The emerald necklace, earrings and bracelet, each piece crafted in the shape of delicate birds, had indeed vanished, leaving only a few less valuable items scattered on the carpet. Colonel Ashford's military instincts seized upon the obvious conclusion. "You were alone up here, Miss Ashworth. No one else heard these alleged noises. How convenient that you should discover the theft of your own jewelry." "How dare you suggest such a thing?" Victoria's voice cracked with emotion. "I would never. Lady Constance was like a mother to me." "A mother whose death has made you considerably wealthier," Adrian Cross observed with cold calculation. "Your inheritance from the estate is not inconsiderable." But Poirot had been conducting his own examination of the scene, moving through the room with the methodical precision of a clockmaker. He knelt beside the forced jewelry case, studying the damage with his magnifying glass, then examined the windowsill and the carpet near the door with equal care. "Most interesting," he murmured, rising to face the assembled group. "The lock on this case was forced, oui, but observe the angle of the damage. It was done by someone kneeling on the floor beside the dressing table, not standing above it. And here," he pointed to a barely visible scuff mark on the polished floorboard just inside the door. "Fresh scratches in the wood, made by someone moving hastily in the darkness." Dr. Pemberton examined the jewelry case more closely. The lock was broken with considerable force, using a blunt instrument, but the work was hurried, almost frantic. "Exactly, mon docteur." Poirot's dark eyes moved from person to person, cataloguing their reactions. "And yet, Mademoiselle Ashworth, you claim to have been here when this violation occurred. You heard the intruder but did not cry out for help, did not attempt to stop them." Victoria's face had gone pale as parchment. "I was frightened. I hid in the corridor until I thought they had gone. When I came back, I found my room like this." The evidence seemed damning. Victoria's presence at the scene, her access to the room, her inheritance from Lady Constance's death. It all pointed to her guilt with the kind of obvious clarity that would satisfy most investigators. James Whitmore's expression had hardened with suspicion, and even Eleanor looked at her goddaughter with newfound doubt. But I had seen that particular expression on Poirot's face before, the slight narrowing of his eyes, the way he stroked his moustache with one finger. It was the look of a man who saw beyond the surface, who recognized a carefully constructed facade designed to mislead. "The case appears to solve itself, does it not?" Poirot said quietly, his tone deceptively mild. "The obvious suspect, caught in the obvious circumstances, with the obvious motive. How very convenient." He moved to the window, which remained securely latched from within, then returned to examine the calling card once more. "But I think, mes amis, that someone wishes us to reach this obvious conclusion. Someone who understands that in moments of crisis, people prefer simple answers to complex truths." The implication hung heavy in the cold air. While the others might be content to accept Victoria's apparent guilt, I knew Poirot was not. The first false lead had presented itself exactly as Christie's formula demanded, but the true game was only beginning. Outside, the snow continued to fall, burying Greystone Manor deeper in its silent, white embrace, and with it, the truth that someone was so desperate to hide. Poirot's observation about the convenience of obvious conclusions seemed to hang in the cold air like a challenge. He moved closer to Victoria, his dark eyes studying her with the intensity of a physician examining symptoms, yet his voice remained gentle when he spoke. "Mademoiselle Ashworth, you returned to this room for a specific purpose, did you not? The emeralds, they were not your primary concern." Victoria's hands twisted in her lap, and I saw the internal struggle play across her delicate features. The others watched with the hungry attention of spectators at a trial, sensing that something significant was about to be revealed. "Lady Constance gave me something after dinner," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "An envelope. She told me to hide it and open it at midnight, alone. She said it contained information that would change everything." James Whitmore stepped forward sharply. "What sort of information?" "I don't know. I never had the chance to read it." Victoria gestured toward the destroyed wardrobe with trembling fingers. "There's a hidden panel at the back, behind the false bottom. I put the envelope there after we finished the game's scenarios. When I came up and found my room like this, the panel had been torn away. The envelope was gone." Poirot moved to examine the wardrobe with renewed interest, his magnifying glass revealing details invisible to the rest of us. "Ah, oui. Here we see the truth of the matter. The wood is splintered from inside out, suggesting someone knew exactly where to look. And observe these fragments of red wax ground into the carpet. The envelope was opened here, in this very room. Dr. Pemberton leaned closer to examine Poirot's findings. But that would mean the intruder knew about the hidden panel. Precisely, mon docteur, our thief possessed intimate knowledge of this room's secrets, knowledge that comes only from long familiarity or careful observation. Poirot's gaze swept over the assembled group. Tell me, who among you has had occasion to spend time in Mademoiselle Ashworth's private chambers? The question created an uncomfortable silence. Eleanor Whitmore colored slightly, while Colonel Ashford cleared his throat with military disapproval at the impropriety suggested. Adrian Cross, however, met Poirot's gaze directly. I helped Lady Constance catalogue several items throughout the house last month, including some pieces in the guest rooms. It was part of the insurance assessment I mentioned. How thorough of you, monsieur. And during this assessment, did you perhaps discover other interesting architectural features? Hidden compartments, secret panels, the sort of curiosities one finds in houses of this age. Cross's composure flickered almost imperceptibly. Old houses often have such features. Lady Constance was quite proud of Greystone's history. Indeed. And the envelope that Mademoiselle Ashworth describes, thick cream paper, sealed with the Blackwood crest, would such a document be of interest to a man in your profession? I deal in art and antiquities, not personal correspondence. But personal correspondence can reveal much about the provenance of art and antiquities, can it not? Family secrets, financial difficulties, perhaps even questions about the legitimate ownership of certain valuable pieces? The implications of Poirot's questions were becoming clear to everyone in the room. If Lady Constance had discovered something compromising about Cross's activities, a midnight revelation could have proven catastrophic to his reputation and livelihood. Madame Petrova crossed herself dramatically. You think this envelope contained evidence of wrongdoing? I think, madame, that Lady Constance was a woman who observed much and said little. Her Christmas game tonight was not mere entertainment. It was a test. She was watching for reactions, cataloguing responses, building a case. Poirot moved to the window, which remained securely latched, and someone realized that her midnight revelation would expose more than they could afford to have known. As if summoned by his words, a new sound drifted up from the floors below, a faint, metallic trilling that seemed to echo through the manor's corridors. We all froze, recognizing the distinctive sound of mechanical clockwork birds, their tiny mechanisms winding down in a series of overlapping melodies. The calling birds, James Whitmore said grimly. 4 of them, by the sound. Poirot nodded with grim satisfaction. Our killer continues the pattern, but grows more bold, or perhaps more desperate. He turned to face us all, his expression grave. The game Lady Constance began tonight is far from over, mes amis. But now we play by different rules, and the stakes have become considerably higher. The grandfather clock in the hall chimed midnight, its deep tones seeming to mark not just the passage of time, but the inexorable approach of whatever revelation our mysterious adversary had planned for the remaining hours of this longest night. Outside, the snow continued to fall, sealing us within Greystone Manor with a killer whose elaborate scheme was only beginning to unfold. The mechanical trilling led us down the main staircase and through the ground-floor corridors, growing steadily louder as we approached the music room at the rear of the house. The sound had an otherworldly quality in the darkness, like ghostly songbirds calling across the centuries from some forgotten aviary. Our oil lamps cast wavering shadows on the family portraits that lined the walls, their painted eyes seeming to follow our progress with silent judgment. The music room door stood ajar, revealing a scene of calculated theatricality that made us all pause on the threshold. 4 exquisite mechanical songbirds, each crafted from precious metals and adorned with tiny jeweled eyes, had been arranged on the grand piano's polished surface. They moved in synchronized precision, their delicate beaks opening and closing as internal clockwork mechanisms produced the haunting melodies we had been following. Between them lay another calling card, its elegant script now grimly familiar. The 4th day of Christmas. But it was not the mechanical birds that drew Poirot's immediate attention. His dark eyes had fixed upon something far more disturbing. A trail of dark spots leading from the music room toward the estate office corridor, barely visible on the Persian carpet, but unmistakably fresh. Blood, Dr. Pemberton confirmed quietly, kneeling to examine the stains with professional interest. Not much, but recent. We followed the trail through the narrow passage that led to Lady Constance's private business quarters, our collective tension mounting with each step. The office door hung open, revealing a scene of controlled violence that made Eleanor Whitmore gasp and press her handkerchief to her lips. Larkin, the elderly butler, lay bound with silk curtain cords beside the overturned desk chair, a makeshift gag fashioned from what appeared to be a linen napkin secured around his mouth. His usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, and a thin trickle of blood had dried on his temple where something had struck him. Most significantly, the wall safe stood open, its heavy door revealing empty compartments where valuable items had once rested. Dr. Pemberton moved swiftly to examine the injured servant, while Poirot conducted his own methodical investigation of the scene. The Belgian detective's attention focused first on the bonds that secured Larkin's wrists, silk cords tied with precise, economical knots that spoke of someone familiar with such work. "The binding is professional," Poirot observed, his magnifying glass revealing details invisible to the rest of us. Not the hasty work of a panicked thief, but the careful preparation of someone who knew exactly what they intended to accomplish. He moved to examine the opened safe, noting that the lock showed no signs of forcing. Keys were used, mes amis. Our thief possessed legitimate access to Lady Constance's most private repository. James Whitmore pushed past us to peer into the empty safe, his face growing pale as he catalogued the missing items. "The Blackwood signet rings," he said hoarsely. 5 of them, representing 5 generations of the family. They were to be donated to the British Museum next month. 5 gold rings, Eleanor whispered, unconsciously echoing the Christmas carol that had become our killer's macabre theme. Poirot knelt beside the recovering butler as Dr. Pemberton worked to remove his bonds. "Larkin, can you tell us what happened?" The elderly servant's eyes fluttered open, focusing slowly on our assembled faces. "Heard the music, sir," he said weakly, his voice hoarse from the gag. "Those mechanical birds singing in the music room. Went to investigate, thinking perhaps one of the guests was having trouble sleeping. When I returned, I saw light under the office door. As I entered, someone struck me from behind." "Did you see your attacker?" "No, sir, but there was a smell. Something medicinal, sharp and clean, like the liniment the Colonel uses for his war wounds." Colonel Ashford shifted uncomfortably. "Half the household knows about my embrocation. It's hardly evidence of guilt." But Poirot was examining the gag with renewed interest, holding the linen to his nose with delicate precision. "Violets," he murmured. "A distinctive perfume, not commonly worn by gentlemen." Eleanor Whitmore flushed deeply. Violet water is hardly unusual. Any lady might wear such a scent. "Indeed, madam, but combined with access to the safe keys, knowledge of the house's routines, and the medical expertise suggested by these precise knots." Poirot's voice trailed off meaningfully as his gaze moved from person to person. Dr. Pemberton finished his examination of Larkin's injuries. A single blow, delivered with something blunt but not heavy, calculated to render unconscious without causing serious harm. Someone with medical knowledge would know exactly how much force to apply. The implication hung heavy in the cold air. Adrian Cross had remained notably silent throughout our investigation, his dark eyes fixed on the empty safe with an expression that might have been calculation or fear. "Madame Petrova clutched her shawl more tightly, her theatrical composure finally beginning to crack under the mounting tension. "The mechanical birds," Poirot said suddenly, returning to examine the delicate automatons still performing their synchronized dance on the piano. "Swiss craftsmanship, early 19th century. Exceptionally valuable, but more importantly, they required winding and precise timing to create the distraction that drew us away from this room." He lifted one of the birds with careful fingers, noting the fresh oil on its mechanisms. Someone with knowledge of clockwork, someone who understood exactly how long these devices would continue to play, planned this theft with the precision of a military operation. Victoria Ashworth moved closer to examine the birds, her artistic eye drawn to their exquisite craftsmanship. "Lady Constance showed these to me last month. She said they had been a wedding gift to her great-grandmother, but she was considering selling them to help with the estate's financial difficulties." "Ah," Poirot said softly. "And who, mademoiselle, was advising Lady Constance on such sales?" All eyes turned to Adrian Cross, whose composure finally cracked entirely. "She asked for my professional opinion on several pieces. There's nothing sinister about providing legitimate appraisals. Nothing sinister, perhaps, but most convenient for someone planning to acquire those same pieces through less legitimate means." Poirot's tone remained deceptively mild, but I recognized the steel beneath the silk. "Tell me, monsieur, where exactly were you when poor Larkin was attacked?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and I realized we had reached another crucial moment in Poirot's investigation. The mechanical birds continued their haunting song, marking time toward whatever revelation the remaining hours of this longest night would bring. Outside, the snow continued to fall, sealing us ever more completely within Greystone Manor with a killer whose elaborate Christmas game was far from over. Cross's composure finally cracked under Poirot's relentless scrutiny, his usual urbane demeanor giving way to visible agitation. "I was in the conservatory," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled anxiety. "I needed air after the shock of Lady Constance's death. The mechanical birds were already playing when I heard them, so I assumed someone else had wound them." "And you remained there how long, monsieur?" Poirot's tone remained deceptively mild, but his dark eyes missed nothing of Cross's discomfort. "Perhaps 20 minutes. I was gathering my thoughts about the evening's events." "Alone, naturally." "Yes, completely alone." The answer came too quickly, too emphatically. Poirot moved to examine the silk cords that had bound Larkin, holding them to the lamplight with characteristic precision. "These knots are most instructive, mes amis. Not the hasty work of a panicked thief, but the careful technique of someone with specialized knowledge, medical training perhaps, or experience in restraining patients during surgical procedures." Dr. Pemberton shifted uncomfortably, his medical bag clutched tightly in his hands. "Such knowledge is not uncommon among educated individuals." "Indeed, mon docteur, but combined with the precise force required to render unconsciousness without permanent injury, it suggests someone with intimate understanding of human anatomy." Poirot's gaze moved deliberately from the doctor to the other assembled guests. Someone who knew exactly where to strike, how much pressure to apply. The implications hung heavy in the cold air, but before anyone could respond, a new sound drew our attention. The faint clatter of crockery from the direction of the kitchens. We followed the noise through the service corridors, our oil lamps casting wavering shadows on the stone walls. In the cold pantry, we discovered a scene of macabre artistry that made Eleanor Whitmore gasp with horror. 6 large mixing bowls had been arranged in precise formation on the marble preparation table, each containing a single white egg tied with green ribbon. Propped against the central bowl was another calling card, bearing the now familiar, elegant script, "The 6th day of Christmas." "6 geese a-laying," Victoria whispered, her artistic eye taking in the careful composition. "But these are hen's eggs." "Symbolism often requires adaptation, mademoiselle." Poirot examined the scene with methodical attention, noting the fine dusting of flour on the floor and the faint smear of something aromatic on the door frame. He touched his finger to the mark and brought it to his nose. Violet water, the same scent that perfumed poor Larkin's gag. Madame Petrova pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, her theatrical composure finally beginning to crack. Many ladies wear such perfume. It proves nothing. Perhaps not, madame, but it establishes a pattern of carelessness that our killer cannot afford. Poirot's attention turned to the stolen items they had catalogued throughout the evening. The jade figurine, the ivory doves, the golden rings. Each piece carries significance beyond mere monetary value. They represent protection, fidelity, and lineage. Someone seeks not just wealth, but the destruction of what these symbols represent. Dr. Pemberton stepped forward, his professional demeanor cracking under the strain. Constance was more than a patient to me, he said quietly, his voice heavy with decades of suppressed emotion. I loved her, have loved her for 30 years, but I would never have harmed her, regardless of what secrets she may have discovered. Ah, mon docteur, but what if those secrets threatened not just your reputation, but the very foundation of everything you held dear? Poirot's voice carried a note of genuine sympathy. What if Lady Constance's midnight revelation would have destroyed not only your practice, but your cherished memories of a love that sustained you through decades of silence? The confession hung in the air like a sword of Damocles, revealing motivations that ran far deeper than simple greed or inheritance disputes. Yet something in Poirot's manner suggested this, too, was not the complete truth he sought. As the grandfather clock chimed 1:30, a new sound echoed through the manor, the sharp crack of breaking glass from the upper floors, followed by a woman's scream that cut through the night like a blade. The mechanical precision of our killer's Christmas game was accelerating, and I realized with growing dread that the most dangerous phase of this longest night was only beginning. "Come, mes amis," Poirot said grimly, already moving toward the stairs. I fear our killer's performance is entering its final act, and the stakes have become considerably higher than mere theft or reputation. Someone among us is prepared to kill again to protect their secret, and we must prevent it at all costs. We rushed toward the sound of that terrible scream, our oil lamps casting wild shadows along the upper corridor as we climbed the main staircase with urgent haste. The cry had come from the long gallery in the east wing, where the family's most prized art collection was displayed behind glass-fronted cases. As we reached the doorway, a rush of winter air met us through a shattered window pane, and glittering fragments of glass lay scattered across the Persian carpet like fallen stars. Madame Petrova knelt beside an overturned pedestal, her elaborate shawl torn and disheveled, one trembling hand pressed to her temple where a thin line of blood traced through her dark hair. At her feet lay the ruins of what had once been 7 exquisite Venetian glass swans, their delicate forms now reduced to a glittering drift of crystal fragments. The birds had been arranged with obvious care before their destruction, creating a tableau of artificial elegance that spoke of both artistry and calculated malice. Propped against the overturned pedestal was another calling card bearing the familiar, elegant script, "The 7th day of Christmas." "Mon Dieu," she whispered, her accent more pronounced in her distress. He came from the shadows behind me. I heard footsteps, turned to look, and then something struck the window. The glass, it exploded inward, and I fell. Dr. Pemberton moved swiftly to examine her injuries, his medical training overriding the emotional turmoil that had marked his earlier confession. "Superficial cuts from the glass fragments," he announced after a careful examination. "Painful, but not serious. You were fortunate, madame." But Poirot's attention had already moved beyond the injured woman to examine the scene with his characteristic, methodical precision. He approached the shattered window, holding his lamp close to study the pattern of broken glass. "Observe, mes amis," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the wind that whistled through the damaged pane. The glass falls mostly outward to the terrace, not inward as one would expect from an external attack. This window was struck from within, with considerable force and deliberate intent. He moved to examine the destroyed swans, noting their careful arrangement before the violence that had claimed them. These birds were not kept here habitually. Someone arranged them specifically for this tableau, positioning them beneath the window to create the impression of swans a-swimming before their destruction. James Whitmore stepped forward, his face pale in the lamplight. But who would do such a thing? And why destroy objects of such beauty? Because, monsieur, the destruction was not the purpose, it was the distraction. Poirot's dark eyes moved to a small escritoire near the window, where a rectangular patch of dust marked the absence of something that had rested there for years. Larkin, what was kept on this writing desk? The elderly butler, still unsteady from his earlier ordeal, leaned heavily against the door frame. Lady Constance's correspondence ledger, sir. She recorded all her private letters there, addresses, appointments, personal matters of the household. Precisely. And while our attention was drawn to the theatrical destruction of the swans, this far more valuable prize disappeared as quietly as a whisper in the wind. Poirot knelt beside Madame Petrova, his voice gentle but insistent. "The person who attacked you, madame. Did you catch any scent, any distinctive odor?" She nodded slowly, wincing as the movement aggravated her injuries. "Oui, something sweet and floral. Like the perfume the English ladies favor. Violets, I think." The observation hung in the cold air like an accusation, and I noticed Eleanor Whitmore's hand move instinctively to her reticule, where I knew she kept her small bottle of violet water. The gesture was subtle, almost unconscious, but Poirot's keen eyes missed nothing. "Most illuminating," he murmured, then addressed the group with renewed authority. "We shall return to the ground floor immediately. Our killer grows more desperate with each passing hour, and desperation breeds carelessness." As we made our way back through the corridors, the grandfather clock chimed 1:30, its deep tones seeming to mark not just the passage of time, but the inexorable approach of whatever final revelation awaited us. But before we could reach the main staircase, a new sound drew our attention. The hollow clink of metal upon stone, steady as a metronome, accompanied by the soft splash of liquid. 8, Poirot said grimly, his expression growing darker. "Our industrious friend maintains the schedule with mathematical precision." We followed the sound through the service passages to the old dairy, a white-tiled chamber that had once been the pride of the manor's domestic operations. On the flagstone floor, arranged in perfect formation, stood 8 polished milk pails, filled not with cream, but with snow, packed hard as ice. A 9th pail lay tilted on its side, its metal handle tapping against the stone with the maddening regularity we had heard from the corridors above. Propped against the central pail was another calling card, the 8th day of Christmas. And there, placed with deliberate prominence on the shelf above the macabre display, lay Lady Constance's missing correspondence ledger, its leather cover dark with age, its brass clasp unfastened, and a single page torn cleanly from its center. "8 maids a-milking," Victoria whispered, her artistic eye taking in the grotesque tableau, but filled with snow instead of milk. Poirot moved to examine the ledger with infinite care, his fingers barely touching the leather binding. The missing page was removed with precision, not torn in haste. Someone knew exactly what they sought and where to find it. He looked up at our assembled faces, his dark eyes reflecting the lamplight like polished obsidian. "The game approaches its conclusion, mes amis, but our killer has made a fatal error. In their haste to destroy evidence, they have instead provided Hercule Poirot with the final piece of a most complex puzzle." The wind continued to howl outside, sealing us ever more completely within Greystone Manor, with a murderer whose elaborate Christmas masquerade was approaching its most dangerous phase. But I could see in Poirot's expression that the little grey cells had finally assembled the scattered pieces into a coherent whole. and the moment of revelation was drawing near. Poirot examined the correspondence ledger with the methodical precision of a master craftsman, his magnifying glass revealing subtle details that spoke volumes about the missing page. The torn edge showed signs of hasty removal, but the precision of the cut suggested someone intimately familiar with the ledger's organization and contents. The missing entry was dated precisely 3 weeks ago, he murmured, running his finger along the jagged edge. See here, mes amis, the partial watermark still visible. Harley Street Medical Association letterhead. And these faint impressions in the paper beneath, they tell us much about what was written above. Dr. Pemberton shifted uncomfortably, his medical bag trembling in his grip. Constance had been making inquiries about my credentials, my past. She'd grown suspicious about certain irregularities in my practice. What sort of irregularities, mon docteur? I was struck off the medical register 20 years ago for falsifying records to cover gambling debts. I've been practicing under forged credentials ever since, serving families who trusted me without question. His voice cracked with decades of suppressed guilt. Constance discovered the truth and planned to expose me at midnight. Yet something in Poirot's expression suggested this confession, while significant, was not the complete solution he sought. He moved to examine the snow-filled pails more closely, noting their mathematical precision and the unusual density of the packed snow. Observe the careful arrangement, the systematic spacing, he said quietly. This required multiple trips to the courtyard, working steadily while we were occupied elsewhere. Someone with intimate knowledge of the house's routines and our movements throughout the evening. As if summoned by his words, a new sound echoed through the manor, the rhythmic thudding of feet upon wooden floors, accompanied by the delicate chime of silver bells. The noise came from the ballroom, growing steadily more frenzied and theatrical. 9, Poirot said grimly, already moving toward the sound. Our killer maintains their schedule with obsessive precision. We followed the cacophony through the main corridor to the ballroom's ornate double doors, which stood ajar to reveal a scene of macabre artistry. 9 pairs of dancing slippers had been arranged in a perfect circle on the polished parquet floor, each pair fitted with tiny silver bells that chimed with every movement of the air currents. A gramophone in the center played a waltz at half speed, its needle scratching across a worn record to produce a haunting, distorted melody. But it was the figure suspended from the crystal chandelier that drew our horrified attention. A dressmaker's dummy, clothed in Lady Constance's evening gown and surrounded by violet-scented silk scarves, swayed gently in the drafts like a grotesque marionette. Its blank face seemed to regard us with eternal accusation. Propped against the gramophone was another calling card. The 9th day of Christmas. 9 ladies dancing, Victoria whispered, her artistic eye taking in the obscene tableau. But this is a mockery of everything Lady Constance represented. Poirot moved through the circle of dancing shoes with careful steps, his attention focused not on the theatrical display, but on something far more revealing. The dust patterns on this floor tell a fascinating story, he observed. This room has been undisturbed for weeks, yet here we see fresh footprints in a specific pattern. Someone has been rehearsing this arrangement through multiple secret visits. He approached the gramophone, studying the worn record with his magnifying glass. Lady Constance's wedding waltz, played at her marriage 40 years ago. Someone with intimate knowledge of family history chose this piece for its emotional significance. As he spoke, I noticed Eleanor Whitmore's unconscious movement toward her reticule, where she kept her violet water. The gesture was subtle, almost reflexive, but Poirot's keen eyes missed nothing. More tellingly, I observed the faint bloom of flower still dusting her elegant black shoes, evidence of her presence in the pantry during the earlier tableau. The killer seeks not mere destruction, Poirot continued, his voice carrying new authority, but the preservation of a secret so damaging that multiple murders became preferable to exposure. Each tableau, Each stolen item, each carefully orchestrated scene has served to misdirect our attention while evidence was systematically destroyed. The grandfather clock chimed 2:30, its deep tones marking our passage deeper into this longest night. As the last note faded, Poirot turned to face us all with an expression of grim finality. The psychological game approaches its conclusion, mes amis. Our killer has maintained their elaborate Christmas masquerade with mathematical precision, but precision becomes predictability, and predictability is the enemy of the perfect crime. The final revelation awaits us, and I fear the most shocking truths are yet to be unveiled. The dancing shoes continued their ghostly ballet as we prepared for whatever climactic confrontation the remaining hours would bring. The macabre ballet of dancing shoes gradually stilled as Poirot led us back to the drawing room where this nightmare had begun. The fire had burned low in the grate, casting wavering shadows across Lady Constance's shrouded form, while outside the relentless wind continued its assault against the frost-covered windows. He positioned himself before the mantelpiece with characteristic precision, his dark eyes surveying each member of our assembled company with the intensity of a master craftsman examining his completed work. "Mes amis," he began, his voice cutting through the exhausted silence like a blade through silk. "We have witnessed tonight a most elaborate performance. 12 tableaux of increasing complexity, each designed to conceal a terrible truth beneath layers of theatrical misdirection. But every performance, no matter how carefully rehearsed, contains moments of genuine revelation for those who possess the patience to observe." He moved to Lady Constance's scattered notebook, gathering the pages with reverent care. The game that began this evening was indeed detection, but not the harmless entertainment our hostess intended. Lady Constance had discovered a systematic betrayal by someone she trusted implicitly, and her Christmas masquerade was designed to force the guilty party into revealing themselves through psychological pressure. Dr. Pemberton stepped forward, his earlier confession weighing heavily upon his shoulders. "I've already admitted my deception about my medical credentials. Constance planned to expose my fraudulent practice at midnight. Indeed, mon docteur, your secret was significant, but it was not worth multiple murders to conceal. The killer we seek possessed a far more devastating truth, one that threatened not merely reputation, but the very foundation of their carefully constructed life." Poirot's gaze moved deliberately around the room, cataloging reactions with surgical precision. The stolen items tell their own story, symbols of protection, fidelity, and family lineage. Someone sought to destroy the evidence of their own systematic betrayal of these sacred trusts. He lifted the correspondence ledger, its torn page a silent accusation. The missing entry was not about medical fraud, but about a far more personal violation. Lady Constance had discovered that someone with intimate access to her home had been systematically looting her collection for months, working in collaboration with Monsieur Cross to replace genuine pieces with expert forgeries while the originals were sold through private channels. Adrian Cross's face had gone ashen, but Poirot continued without pause. "Your expertise in art authentication provided the perfect cover for this deception, monsieur, but you were not the architect of this scheme. You were merely the instrument, manipulated by someone with far more intimate knowledge of this house and its treasures." His attention turned to Eleanor Whitmore, whose elegant composure had been steadily deteriorating throughout the long night. The recurring scent of violet water, which many dismissed as commonplace, was in fact a signature as distinctive as a fingerprint. It perfumed poor Larkin's gag, marked the door frame of the pantry where the geese a-laying were arranged, and clung to Madame Petrova's attacker in the gallery. It is also, Madame, the very distinctive fragrance that you favor, particularly when under stress, as you have been this entire evening. Eleanor's carefully maintained facade began to crack, her hands trembling as she clutched her reticule. "Many ladies wear violet water," she whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. "Indeed, but combined with other evidence, it becomes damning. The flour dusting your elegant shoes from your presence in the pantry, the intimate knowledge of family history required for tonight's elaborate Christmas carol theme, the systematic access to Lady Constance's private papers and correspondence, all point to someone who had spent years in this house, learning its secrets, earning its trust. Poirot moved closer, his voice growing gentler, yet more inexorable. James was planning to divorce you, was he not, madame? After 20 years of marriage, he had found someone younger, someone who represented a fresh start. The settlement would have left you with a modest allowance, but nothing approaching the lifestyle you had grown to consider your birthright. James Whitmore stared at his wife in growing horror. Eleanor, you knew about Sarah, but I never said I wanted a divorce. You didn't need to say it, Eleanor replied, her voice hollow with defeat. I could see it in your eyes, in the way you spoke of her. I knew it was only a matter of time before you found the courage to leave me for your precious secretary. And so you began your careful campaign of theft, Poirot continued, working with Monsieur Cross to identify the most valuable pieces, arranging for forgeries to be created, selling the originals through his private network. The jade figurine was merely the beginning, a test to see if your deception would be detected. It started so simply, Eleanor confessed, tears streaming down her face. One piece, just to have something set aside for my future security. But then Lady Constance began asking questions, examining pieces more closely with that magnifying glass of hers. Tonight's game was designed to expose me through psychological pressure, to force me into revealing myself through nervous reactions to her carefully orchestrated scenarios. And when you realized that her midnight revelation would destroy everything, your marriage, your social position, your financial security, you struck her with the golden partridge during the confusion of the darkened room. The shock to her heart was sufficient to cause her death. But you were not finished. You needed to destroy the evidence of your systematic theft and create enough confusion to obscure your guilt. Eleanor nodded mutely, her confession spilling forth like water through a broken dam. Each tableau bought me time to search for and destroy the documentation of my activities. The correspondence ledger contained records of her suspicions, copies of the insurance assessments, private inquiries she'd made about the authenticity of various pieces. I had to make it look like random theft, like someone was following the Christmas carol pattern for their own twisted reasons. But in your desperation to maintain the theatrical framework, you made fatal errors. The violet water that marked your presence at each scene, the flour from the pantry, the intimate knowledge of family history required for your elaborate displays, all created a trail that led inexorably back to you. The grandfather clock chimed 3 times, its deep tones marking the approach of dawn and the end of this longest night. As the last note faded, Poirot turned to face Eleanor with an expression of profound sadness mixed with inexorable justice. The human heart, madame, is capable of both extraordinary love and terrible darkness. Your attachment to this house and its treasures became a poison that consumed everything else: loyalty, honor, even basic human decency. In your fear of losing what you believed you could not live without, you destroyed the very thing you sought to preserve. As the first pale light of Christmas morning began to filter through the frost-covered windows, the local constabulary finally arrived, having battled through the snow-clogged roads to reach Greystone Manor. Eleanor Whitmore was taken into custody with quiet dignity, her elaborate Christmas masquerade finally at an end. Poirot stood at the drawing-room window, watching the police vehicles disappear down the manor's long drive, their tire tracks dark against the pristine snow. "The greatest mysteries, mon ami," he said to me quietly, "are not found in locked rooms or impossible crimes, but in the depths of the human soul. There, in that darkness, we discover that the most ordinary people are capable of the most extraordinary evil when driven by fear, greed, and the desperate desire to preserve what they believe defines their very existence. He retrieved his leather valise and adjusted his perfectly knotted tie with characteristic precision. The 12 murders of Christmas Eve were, in the end, an elaborate deception. One murder disguised as many, theft masquerading as random violence, desperation wearing the mask of methodical planning. But truth, mes amis, has a way of emerging no matter how many layers of deception are piled upon it. As we prepared to leave Greystone Manor, Poirot paused at the threshold to deliver his final observation. Lady Constance's last Christmas gathering did indeed change everything, though not in the way she intended. She sought to expose a thief and instead unmasked a killer. The game she designed to reveal character succeeded beyond her darkest imaginings. The snow continued to fall, covering the ancient stones of Greystone Manor in pristine white, as if nature itself sought to cleanse the house of the terrible secrets it had harbored. But some stains, I reflected, go deeper than snow can cover, and the memory of this Christmas Eve would haunt us all for years to come. The affair at Greystone Manor was concluded, but its lessons about the darkness that can lurk beneath the most civilized facades would remain with Hercule Poirot and with me for the rest of our days.